Hi, thanks for joining us for this Facebook Live conversation. I'm Claire Foran, and I'm an associate editor here at The Atlantic.
I'm Juleika Lantigua Williams, and I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic.
And today we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's recent accusations that Hillary Clinton is playing the women's card and the potential political fallout. So, as I'm sure you're well aware, this week Donald Trump started leveling an accusation against Hillary Clinton that she is using the women's card. And in response, Clinton has sort of embraced that criticism in the sense that she has said, you know, if playing the women's card means fighting for paid family leave, fighting for women's health care, fighting for equal pay, then deal me in. And so this was sort of an exchange that Trump's comments and Clinton's response came after the series of recent primary contests this week, and seemed to indicate that this line of attack from Trump may be something that if both the candidates make it into a general election, we might see a lot more of. So, for me, you know, I'm interested in hearing what you think about it. For me, it's the first thing it recalled was Mitt Romney's use of binders full of women, and it's sort of, I think, as we've seen in the aftermath of it, it's this comment, you know, the women's card, that's sort of it's sort of this fairly simplistic comment that can be used. It's so kind of quotable and kind of sound biteable, and you know, immediately is something that Democrats jumped on. Hillary Clinton's campaign started fundraising off of the remark. It's something that you can see, you know, showing up in easily in sort of 30-second attack ads that Democrats use, you know, not only to sort of attack Donald Trump as being sort of out of touch or insensitive, but really the entire Republican Party. And I think that you know, there's sort of a real question of whether or not, you know, this will resonate with the people that Donald Trump is trying to sort of target. And then the other thing that's interesting is that it's, you know, his implication seems to be that playing the women's card actually sort of confers an advantage, because when asked to elaborate on, you know, what exactly it means to play the women's card, Trump has elaborated and said, you know, that's the only thing she has going for her. If she were a man, I think she'd only be getting, you know, 5% of the vote, something like that. So what did you think about his suggestion that it's actually an advantage to play the women's card? Or?
Well, I love being a woman, so yes, being a woman is an advantage, but not in the way that he thinks it's an advantage. Clearly, he's out of touch with what the reality is for women, for working mothers, for women in schools, right? So women make, you know, white women make 74 cents per every dollar that a male does. Latina women make 54 cents. Black women make something like 67 cents. So no, in this society, it's not advantageous to be a woman in that regard. But the irony is that he wanted, in a way, to disengage women voters by saying that they would be reduced to voting for a woman, when in fact many women have been waiting decades, generations, to vote for a woman. And I don't think that that necessarily means that he's allowed to discount that vote. I am allowed as a woman voter to vote for another woman just because she's a woman. Now, that comes with the responsibility of understanding the choice that I'm making, right? If I decide to vote for a woman who's less qualified, then I have to live with that choice. And Donald Trump or any other politician cannot simply throw away that choice that I am allowed to make as a voter. I am allowed to make bad choices, whether it's for a woman or for another candidate. And so for me, that was the first reaction. But I thought, oh, that's such a reductive, you know, it's a really reductive and dismissive way to disallow me to make a choice. You don't get that right? I've earned the right to vote. People fought for this so that I can have the right to vote. So that was my initial reaction. And then secondly, I thought, you really have no idea what it's like to be a woman, right? And you really have no idea that that is actually a rallying cry for many women on both political sides of the spectrum, right? Because this is not just liberal women, quote unquote liberal women, who would vote for a woman to go into the office. There are plenty of conservative women who might not vote for Hillary, but who would be happy to see a woman in the Oval Office. And so I think that that was the other misstatement on his part, that he thought that he could, with a single phrase, sort of dismiss a bunch of have 52% of the world population, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and the other interesting sort of thinking about his comments in terms of what we know statistically, you were talking about, I mean, just from a political perspective, I mean, women are underrepresented in U.S. politics, so his implication, and I feel like it opens him up to so much, not only criticism, but also, I mean, it could so easily become almost this thing that people kind of point and laugh at and sort of say, I've seen so many articles that sort of, people sort of saying, well, let me see, how many women presidents have there been, how effective has the women's card been, apparently, and so it just opens him up to sort of all this mockery, all this snarkiness, so there's sort of an immediate, it's kind of immediately obvious the potential kind of fallout from it that we're already seeing, and I was trying to think of, the way he used the comment, and so one thing that came up for me was sort of, this question of what does he actually mean by the women's card, and he's been pressed on that by several interviewers, and he sort of seems to suggest that, well, it's obvious, you know what I'm talking about, and it was interesting to see Clinton's response. Surely the Clinton campaign sees this as an opportunity, as made obvious by the fact that they're already fundraising off of it, but it's even just seeing the way the two define the women's card. Trump's women's card is just, well, she's a woman and she's playing that up and it's pandering, whereas Clinton's response is, well, if the women's card means, and then listing off sort of all these policy platforms that, equal pay. And then it's been interesting to see the way she's framed those issues, which has been that, when Clinton talks about something like equal pay, she doesn't just talk about it from a perspective of that's a women's issue. And in fact, she has made, she's sort of taken pains to paint this as something that is a family's issue, something that's an economic issue, something that would benefit everybody. So it's interesting to see how Trump deploys this idea of a women's card in such a simplistic way, whereas Clinton frames so-called women's issues as much more inclusive. Yeah. And I think that raises questions, too, about what we mean when we talk about identity politics, because conservatives often use the term identity politics to accuse liberals of kind of dividing people along lines of race and gender in a simplistic way for political gain. But when you look at the way this exchange has unfolded, Trump is actually the politician who has sort of deployed gender in a very simplistic manner in his argument that he's making, where Clinton, at least the way she's responded, has been to make it much more inclusive and about much more than just gender.
Absolutely. I think for me, the second response immediately was, well, you're supposed to be this great businessman, but you clearly don't see or have not read the literature that says it is completely economically advantageous for a company to hire more women. We know now for a fact that companies that have women on the boards do better, that companies that have more of a gender ratio, a more balanced gender ratio, outperform other companies. And so clearly hiring women impacts the bottom line, right, which is supposed to be what he's really great at, right, bringing revenues to his investors. But if you think that hiring women, voting for women is something that is cosmetic, then you're not really looking at the facts. And so for me, that was the second level of response, that I thought, well, you're not a great businessman because you clearly don't see what the advantage is here to you as a businessman, to our economy. But also I think that the other blind spot that he has in this, and it's a pretty serious one, is that so many things have come in the last 10 to 15 years as a result of women, quote unquote, playing the women's card, right? So we've got flex time at work. That's because a lot of working moms wanted to keep working and they also wanted to get home with their babies, right? We've got parental leave now fully paid in most companies for men and for women. That's a result of women wanting the dads to be around, right? And dads also wanting to be around, but they had never sort of like found a coalition around the idea of, I'm a dad, I deserve to be home with my kid, until their wives started demanding it, and then they in turn turned around and demanded it for themselves, right? So people like Mark Zuckerberg, who I think is a great leader in his sector, they get celebrated and applauded, right? Because they're men asserting their right to be with their families, with their young families. Whereas women, we've been saying that for 20, 30 years, right? So yeah, the women card has an advantage, but it's an advantage for every one of us, right? The fact that we've got companies now allowing people to work from home full time, that came from women wanting to do both, right? And having to make great sacrifices to establish themselves in their career and then not wanting to take a pause, which everyone knows can be really detrimental to a woman's career, especially if she's someone who's a high performer, who's a rising star in the company. And so I think Trump spoke really glibly, and I think it is definitely going to come back to bite him. But I think this is a great, one of those teaching moments where we can talk to not just other women, but we can also talk among our colleagues and with our friends and say, guys, he just doesn't get it, and let me show you why it is that he doesn't get it. So, I mean, I'm sort of thankful when he puts his foot in his mouth, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and that's an interesting comment to make, too, because even while you were talking about it, I was thinking it seems like there's some irony to the fact that, even we're sitting here and having this conversation about, gender and gender inequity, and that's a conversation that, and it's not, this is something that, because whenever Trump says things, it sort of spawns a million headlines, a million articles, and so I feel like him saying something that effectively was sort of accusing Clinton of talking about gender for the sake of it and sort of highlighting it for no good reason has actually, there's some irony to the fact that this is like spawning more kind of in-depth conversations, and wouldn't it be sort of funny if Trump is the reason that gender and gender inequality become sort of this like seriously discussed and debated issue, and if that's something that he sort of brings to the election?
Well, I think it would make him really mad. I mean, so the last thing that I thought was, right, as a woman of color, I thought, oh, not again, Trump. You started in showing how ignorant you are and how out of touch you are with the society that you're actually living in, right? You started your campaign by this sort of like frothy mouth, diatribe about Mexican Americans and immigrants and basically everybody who's not a rich person like you, right? And in the past, historically, when social grievances have been brought to the fore by the others, by people of color, by Native Americans, many people reacted by saying, oh, well, they're just playing the race card. So as soon as I heard him say the woman's card, I sort of cringed because I immediately saw parallels to that, right? And what he doesn't essentially get is that now we're living in a world of intersectionality, right, which is one of these great buzzwords that's being thrown around, right? But it is actually a place where there are no more silos, there are no more parallel lines. Everything is actually at a cross-section with something else. So I don't separate my political activism, my political awareness, right? I don't separate that from the realities of living as a woman, right? Of living as a mother, of living as a wife, of living as a woman of color. I don't separate those things, right? And so you cannot dismiss me with a stroke of I'm using the woman's card or I'm using whatever card. I've got many cards, right? I've got many cards that I can play, but I don't ever separate them because they're kind of attached to one another. And I feel like for him, if his worldview is one-dimensional in the way that he wants to paint the rest of us with one stroke, I think it's going to be very dangerous for him. And he's not just risking alienating the voters in his party, but just alienating people who support. If he wants to really one day lead, he just won't have.
And we already know, I mean, we're not, the primary elections aren't finished yet, we're not to the general, but I mean, polling already indicates that Trump has, very highly unfavorable numbers with women voters, and part of his attack was to sort of accuse Clinton also of not doing well with women. And I mean, it's interesting to kind of unpack that because Clinton has struggled to win over younger women voters, and then that's something that her, competitor Bernie Sanders has tended to do better with. But in general, and most polls show that Trump has struggled far more than she has with women voters. So it's hard for me to, I always try to think how will these lines kind of play with different groups of people, and how will they be received. And I do think that there are undoubtedly some people who will view this remark as sort of another example of Trump, not being politically correct, that idea that people find appealing to him, for people that support him. But he has not done well with women voters, and I don't think that this. It's very hard for me to see how this would be something that would reverse that trend, and seems very likely that it would be something that sort of exacerbates the problem that he's faced with women voters. And I also think just the question of what this means more broadly for the Republican Party. I was telling you earlier, I was reading reports of sort of women Republican senators kind of literally running away when reporters have been trying to ask them, what do you think about this women's card remark? And I mean, this is just, it's sort of just another, it just puts another fine point on how the Republican Party establishment has sort of ideas about where they want the party to be, and how Trump just seems in so many ways to be continually kind of dragging kind of the intellectual thinkers of the party. He's sort of dragging the base in an opposite direction, and so again kind of exposing that tension of what the Republican Party sort of stands for and what their rhetoric is going to be. And I feel like this could potentially be, I mean, it's such a blunt statement that is, again, so easily just repeated sort of ad infinitum that
Yes.
I feel like it could really be something, again, that Democrats use to define the entire party. Even if there are many Republicans who and people commented on Chris Christie's wife in the background
Yes,
of
I
his
was going to
video,
bring that up.
sort of seeming to roll her eyes or sort of have almost a visceral reaction to his statement, which again I think speaks to the tension. And I think I'm sure there's a wide sort of variety of reactions among Republicans to Trump's own comments, but there's that risk that this will now become this sort of broad brush kind of conception of the way the party sort of thinks about women voters.
Yeah. No, it's really ironic because Trump has clearly defied, right, and upset all of the, consistently thoughtful Republicans, right, across the country. And one of my initial reactions when he got really serious about his own campaign was to say, oh my God, all of the rational, hardworking, intelligent people who are aligned with the Republican Party because of core beliefs, because of the values that they have, they're going to have this guy representing him. And so immediately there was a great sense of empathy, right? And this was a few months ago for me as I observed it. But now, watching the party in an extremely reactive position toward Trump makes me wonder, what is the agenda? Right? If you're going to let this person take the reins and basically run away with the party identity, right, and sort of run it aground, what are you guys going to do about it? And something similar happened when the Tea Party, sort of like emerged a few years ago during the Obama run. And again, it's the idea of who's in charge here. So for me, the fact that he's been allowed to have, this incredible media blitz, right? I mean, someone calculated that he's gotten billions of dollars worth of free media just because he's able to spark just controversy by just speaking completely off the cuff, not having the sense to let himself be held accountable sometimes. I understand it's politics, you want to be controversial, you want to be provocative, but sometimes you've got to take yourself out of that persona and sort of say, okay, let's really talk about this. It's just you and me across the table. Let's just talk. And I don't know that he's capable of that sort of like intellectual intimacy that is required for you to have a real dialogue with someone. And I think that he's doing a lot of damage right now, and not just to the Republican Party, which should be a stronger party, right? Like, now that we are in a much more participatory, much more inclusive society, I want a multiplicity of political perspectives, right? Healthy political perspectives, so that when we have a national debate, it's really truly a national debate among equally informed, equally engaged people. But I don't think that we can get that with someone who can sort of be so dismissive about a huge, proportion of the population.
Yeah, I mean, and I think with Trump, there's always this sort of, conventional wisdom is that he will say things that political observers, deem kind of or sort of imagine will be damaging to him, and then they're not. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how, the extent to which we can gauge how this comment sort of resonates with Republicans generally. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think it does speak to this kind of conservative idea that liberals, divide along lines of race and gender for political gain, and I think that's what he's speaking to. But again, just seems to be, I really do wonder for Republican women who hear this, sort of what they think, and I'm sure that there's a range of reactions, but it also I think it's interesting to think about how Hillary Clinton has talked about her own gender. I mean, we were discussing that she frames issues like equal pay in sort of intersectional terms, that, this isn't just a woman's issue, it's an issue that affects sort of many different realms and sort of groups of people. But it is interesting to note that in this election she has, as others have observed, she has played up this, the historic nature of her candidacy, the potential to be the first woman president, her role as grandmother, and I thought it was interesting that there's sort of the suggestion that it's possible she might pick like a woman vice president, and I don't know, like what do you think about her choice to emphasize these in a way that was more, it does seem like she's clearly emphasizing her gender and that historic nature of her candidacy more so than the last time she ran.
Well, I think she's taking notes a little bit from Barack Obama's first very, very historic election. And I think she wants to create this sort of momentum that ushered him into the White House. And a lot of it did have to do with the first, right? This sort of like many people generationally felt like they were going to be part of this hugely important historic moment, right? The problem that she comes against is that she's not new. She's not a novelty. She has deep, deep political roots. She was in the White House as First Lady for 8 years, and before that, she was in the governor's house. And then she, sort of moved to New York, planted her flag, and then got herself elected. And I was one of those New Yorkers who voted for her, right? But I voted for her on the strength of her insider knowledge of Washington, D.C. And that insider knowledge seems to be what's keeping a lot of people from full-heartedly endorsing her and supporting her, because she's no longer the novelty first woman. She's another Politico. And so I think strategically she's been really smart to emphasize both of those points to different audiences. So when she's with, younger progressive women, she'll emphasize this idea of you can help me be the first. When she's with more seasoned, older, people, she's emphasizing that there's no one else who's more qualified than me, right? I have been your representative to the world. I have been in the White House. I have been part of drafting really important legislation. And so she's been really savvy about which card, actually, to emphasize with which audiences. But I think at this point, after she's been in our consciousness, in our political awareness for, 30 years, it's going to be a little bit hard for her to change the message.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting too, because so if you think about what Trump is accusing her of, he's sort of accusing her of he said that it's pandering to play the gender card and to just play up that she would be a woman running for office, but it's actually, in a way, I feel like he is to some extent fundamentally misunderstanding the way that she is being received by women voters, because he suggested that in making that argument, he said, that's what she has going for her. So again, suggesting that that's an advantage. But when you look at, and I've thought this is a very interesting dynamic of this election, is that Hillary Clinton has struggled with younger women voters and done much better with older women voters, in this sort of generational divide in the way women view her candidacy. And I think that it's always sort of perilous to try to come up with an overarching theory of why that is, because of course women are not, that's not a monolithic voting bloc, and so I think of course it's going to be impossible to say, oh, it's because of this reason, but people have certainly suggested, and reporting has certainly turned up examples of this idea that there's sort of a feminist split in the way that a younger generation views feminism, and that many younger voters look at somebody like Bernie Sanders and say, well, yes, he's an older white man, but he has more progressive policies, and therefore looking at what he stands for, that will do more to benefit like women of color than Hillary Clinton's more to the center. And so that's actually interesting too, because again, it's Trump is sort of framing this as, well, she's playing up her gender, that will help her, but in actuality, I think that that will be resonant to some people and to some women voters, but, there's certainly evidence to suggest that, even as Hillary Clinton attempts to frame her platform as intersectional, that's been met with skepticism with a younger generation. And so I think there's a lot that's been interesting about that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of the things that I think has been a really positive result of the feminist movement is that young women, and I'm talking about women in their early 20s, maybe in their late teens, think that feminism gives them a right not to vote for a woman, not to always be supporting the cause simply because there's a woman involved. And I think that that's marvelous. I think that that's exactly where we want to be headed. However, as a slightly older, younger woman, I think that we haven't gotten that far yet. And I think that, yes, as much as it is possible to support qualified women, I will do that, right? I'm still undecided about who I'm going to vote for or whether, I support her because she's a woman. But I do know that we have not gotten so far and that we have not reached the level of parity that we need to reach in order to say, okay, women's voices are really, truly being accounted for and they're really being listened and they always have a place at the table. And so I love that younger women do feel empowered to vote for Bernie Sanders. Some of them are supporting Trump and voting for Trump. I think that in itself is a testament to all of the work that was done to get us to this point. But we haven't gotten far enough where there aren't some serious risks to putting someone who does not understand how society really works, who can reflect it in the way that he speaks about it, in the way that his ideas are formulated. I think that there are definitely some real risks, and not just for women. I think that there's some real risks in electing people across the board who are just a little bit out of touch with what's actually happening.
And I don't know if we've gotten any questions, but I was thinking as you were talking as well, it does get to this question of it's, what it represents to have greater gender representation in politics versus what a candidate's platform is. And, I think you said at the beginning that it's a woman's right to decide to vote for a candidate based on gender, but it comes with, if you decide, if that's what your calculation is based off, it does come with that risk of, there is also this question of what does the platform of a particular candidate, actually make them better.
All right, so we've got a really good question. Very simple. Why are Americans taking Trump seriously?
Well, I think that's, there's no, again, it's not, of course, Trump has been, received widely differently by different voters. So it's not that I would say that there's certainly some people who don't take his candidacy seriously. But I think the fact that Donald Trump is the Republican frontrunner, and so regardless of whether or not regardless of what you think of what he says, I think that I personally think everybody should take him seriously, at least to the extent that he's representing, he's tapped into something that is resonant with a lot of people. And I think that to dismiss that is to miss something that's really, fundamental to American sort of society right now. And so I think that, there's sort of a question of what it means to take him seriously, but I do think we should consider what his popularity means and what that means about sort of the fissures and sort of divides in our country right now.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the way that I would frame the question is not why are they taking him seriously, but why is he gathering momentum around people who are usually assumed to be running things or in charge, but who actually feel really disenfranchised, and that's white middle-class America, right? Like, he has tapped into a very deep current of resentment, sometimes anger, sometimes just a sense of economic and social solitude, right? Where people feel like the world is running and is leaving them behind. And I get that. I absolutely get that. Unfortunately, there isn't anyone else standing up whose message resonates as well with that population, and it's the thing of what happens when you leave a vacuum, right? Something comes in and replaces it. And I think that that's one of the soul-searching questions that the Republican Party might have to answer for itself. How do we get back in touch with this core constituency, with this really important part of the country, right? How did we forget about their needs to the extent that they're now thinking that this person might be the one who could fulfill their needs? Yeah, I think it's a really important open-ended question that's going to take a while to answer. Yeah, but let's see if we have another question. I think we have a comment. I am tired of him playing the rich businessman card, especially since it has nothing to do with running the government.
I wonder, okay, so playing the rich businessman card, in that he talks about that as being sort of a reason why
he's
you
qualified.
should. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting too, because in some ways, I mean, all politicians come up with sort of shorthand ways that they are, I mean, making sort of appeals to different groups of people based off of sort of saying, this is kind of my persona, my political persona, and this is why you should vote for me. So in a way, yes, I mean, it's, Hillary Clinton may be emphasizing her gender in some respects, but of course Trump is also emphasizing certain characteristics like his business background. So even that, it's sort of he accuses her of that, but he has his own sort of persona as well.
Okay. Well, here's a good question, actually, and you and I talked about it a few minutes ago. So someone wants to know, what does this mean for conservative women who may have formerly supported Trump or align more with his policy, but still hold fast to the woman card? Have you?
Well, I think this will be our last question, but I mean, I can't speak for conservative women, and of course it's also that it goes back to that there's nothing, it's not going to be a monolithic reaction. But I think that, I think that when Trump talks about this idea of, or when conservatives talk about dividing along gender, I mean, there's certainly women who agree with that sentiment and who would say, I don't think that just because I'm a woman, I should be, buy the fact that I should want to vote for Hillary Clinton or for even a woman who's a Republican candidate. And I think that actually thinking about, and I've written a little bit about this idea of what it is to be a sort of a conservative feminist, and actually Carly Fiorina, who now is sort of popped up on the stage, has talked about how she's a feminist, and I think that I'd love for her to weigh in on this, and maybe she will, of the idea of the women's card, because she's talked a little bit about how being a woman and a businesswoman has impacted her, and so I don't know what conservative women will think about this, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
No, I really don't, because again, I don't think that it's a monolithic group.
Yeah.
I think that a lot has to do with educational levels. It has to do with class. I think that younger women probably have a different definition of what the women's card is, what conservative or liberal, than an older woman, that's someone who might be a grandma, like Hillary Clinton. And so I think that anytime you try to sort of make a blanket statement about a group, you're invariably going to be proven wrong. And so I'm really interested to see what happens at the conventions, to be honest with you, specifically at I think the Republican one is going to be the one to watch, because I'm hoping that a lot of sort of these easily ignited arguments will be taken more seriously, right? Because at that point, a very serious choice will have to be made. A very, very serious choice. And so it will be up to the delegates on the floor and to the people sort of like who run the machinery behind the scenes to say, well, this is how we're going to answer all of these questions that have been coming up since he launched his campaign. Yeah.
And thank you so much for joining us. I'm Claire Foran.
I'm Juleyka Lantigua Williams.